so the big fear for Moscow is if Kadyrov goes, and if the succession isn't handled smoothly enough, if Chechnya once again becomes a problem.
Well, one of Putin's key gubernatorial supporters has been Kadyrov, the governor of Chechnya. He is reported to be in ill health. How important is Kadyrov as a strong man within the Russian system? And if his demise is imminent, is that a destabilizing moment for Putin?
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that in many ways the Russian elite at once praise for and dreads. I mean, Kadyrov is massively unpopular within the elite. Only really Putin and a couple of others of his henchmen really support Kadyrov, who exactly has used the opportunity to extort huge amounts of federal funds. I mean, basically, every time it looks as if the government is going to step down the amount of money they send to Chechnya, much of which gets skimmed off by Kadyrov for his prestige projects and his fancy lifestyle, well, that's the point when Kadyrov essentially starts making a problem. He maybe muses about standing down, or he, as he has done more than once or twice, essentially launched incursions into neighbouring regions or whatever. He causes a problem and Moscow backs down because they basically have convinced themselves that he is the only man who can keep this very turbulent, violent, rebellious region under control. Now, if he is ill, and look, we've had the on and off, Kadyrov's dying, oh, he seems fine, Kadyrov's dying, so we have to be cautious. But on the other hand, there clearly is some evidence behind the idea that he has something seriously wrong with him. If he goes, there is no clear successor. His sons are too young, and anyway, they're just spoiled brats with no real political weight to them. Moscow has a candidate that it would quite like, a man by the name of Abdialudinov, who's currently the commander of Chechen forces in Ukraine. He's seen as a little bit too house-trained by Moscow for most of the interests within Chechnya. And in Chechnya, you still have virtual private armies in existence. And so the big fear for Moscow is if Kadyrov goes, and if the succession isn't handled smoothly enough, if Chechnya once again becomes a problem, well, we've seen in the past that the internal security forces are not up to the job, not alone. In the past, when you've really needed to quell Chechnya, you have to call in the army. And the army's busy at the moment. And this would pose an interesting strategic challenge for Putin. Is he willing to basically hold back and maybe even have to accept losses of territory in Ukraine in order to hold on to Chechnya, a region that, frankly, most Russians would love to see go independent? Or does he hold on, does he basically abandon Chechnya and be the Tsar who actually sees Russia's borders shrink rather than expand? So I think that there's probably a lot of the most highly skilled medical teams in Russia today currently being vectored onto Grozny to try and make damn sure that doesn't happen.
I'm going to get you to take your expertise directly south over the mountains and into Azerbaijan. Tensions with Baku seem to be rising too. Now, in fairness, I always felt incredibly welcome in Baku, and I was clear that the Azerbaijanis were hedging their bets, and if they were really forced to show their hand, they probably would lean towards the West. But tensions now are rising in a way that is very interesting indeed. Does Putin have the capacity to punish the Azeris for any disloyalty?
I mean, the honest answer is not really. I mean, Azerbaijan, oil rich, provides 5% of the European Union's oil, which may not sound much, but is crucial for the EU as a sort of hedge. And that helps explain the rather kind of fawning way that people like Ursula von der Leyen have approached the Azeri. There's no real other way of calling it, dictator Ilham Aliyev. And also, Azerbaijan has forged a very close strategic partnership with Turkey. And we saw, for example, in the wars that they fought over Nagorno-Karabakh in recent years, very heavy influence of Turkey in terms of not just kit like drones, but also in terms of sort of training and such like. And so really this is, I would say, one of the many symptoms of Russian imperial withdrawal. that really we've seen accelerate so fast. We've seen it in Central Asia. In January 2022, Russian forces intervened to basically back the current leader of Kazakhstan in a weird kind of constitutional crisis turned insurgency against his predecessor Nazarbayev. A few months later, he's willing to actually turn against Moscow and criticize the war in Ukraine. Likewise, in the South Caucasus, Armenia had originally banked on having Russian support. The Russians were unwilling or unable to do anything in 2020, let alone now. So, I think this represents, frankly, the degree to which the war in Ukraine, the consequent economic and political impacts, the need to concentrate, 97% of Russia's ground forces, field force, in that conflict, has essentially meant that Russia has lost. It was a process that was happening anyway, but at a vastly accelerated rate, its old role as the regional hegemon. And so basically Azerbaijan is now the South Caucasus regional hegemon.
And this was a sort of popular discussion when we to our point earlier on about a lack of real theory of victory for the Ukrainians. There was a theory of Russian strategic defeat for the West. Admittedly, I don't think this really took into account the Ukrainian cause, but a complete collapse of Russian influence all the way from Mongolia through Kazakhstan and the other Central Asian stans through into the Caucasus and on into Moldova, Serbia, and even Belarus, though I think most thought that would be the last card to fall. That seemed really likely. I got the feeling that countries have actually started to hedge their bets a bit, but in Mongolia, the Chinese influence in Mongolia is climbing rapidly, and the Russians really don't like that because there's enormous resources. The Kazakhs, I think, are riding all horses very well indeed. The Kyrgyz, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, I think, are increasingly leaning towards China, and that's a real cost on the Russian sphere. We've just spoken about Azerbaijan. Armenia seems to feel that in allowing the Russians to mount air missions from Armenia in the early year of war, it didn't do their strategic interest any good. And so the Armenians now feel like they are hedging their bets better. Georgia is an EU accession state. Moldova is an EU accession state. Serbia is increasingly integrated into the EU manufacturing base, even if I think the politics there are not quite as advanced towards EU accession. You can make a pretty good argument that the strategic cost, the grand strategic cost to Russia of the war in Ukraine is immense, and yet nobody in Moscow really seems to care.
I think a lot of people care, but the man at the top, I think, has reached this stage where basically Ukraine has become, for him, the crucial war. This is the war that will define not only his political survival, but also his political legacy. Because after all, this was not meant to be a big war. He rolled in February 2022 thinking it was going to be a very easy thing, that the Ukrainians would sort of shrug and grumble, but would accept the imposition of a puppet regime and such like. Now that it hasn't happened, and now that in some ways, the whole conflict has become really the defining principle of late Putinism, I think that just from his point of view, everything else, if need be, has to be thrown into the fire in order to maintain the war effort. We can even see this with his relationship with China. For all the talk of friendship without limits and so forth, the Chinese have been very hard-nosed. They probably don't want to see Russia lose, but they don't really care if Russia wins. But in the meantime, very tough deals on oil and gas, exactly extended their influence, not just in Central Asia, but far, far more sort of widely. And look, there are people within the Russian state, particularly the next generation down. This is an issue where we've got a real generational divide. Putin and his fellow septuagenarians are willing to basically focus everything on the Ukraine war. The next political generation down actually do think, well, where is Russia going to be 10 years from now? That matters to us. We don't want to be a Chinese vassal state devoid of any friends other than Venezuela and Nicaragua or whatever. But at the moment, they don't have political traction. I think this is the issue. Actually, the degree to which Putin is mortgaging, if not outright burning, Russia's future in the name of fighting his imperial war of the moment is very striking. And as I said, there's a lot of people in Russia who realise it, but the question is, what do you do about it? There's one thing this system is still very good at. It is maintaining control and resisting attempts to change the regime. So I think most people just, they don't like it, but they just keep their heads down and hope it works out.